All right, so you know how like pretty much every phone out there runs on Google's Android software?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Well, uh, starting next week, like around March 27th, 2025,
Mm.
Google's making a big change to how they actually build it
Huge change.
behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And in the next few minutes, we're going to break down what it means like for you in three main areas. First, we'll look at why Google's doing this.
Less headaches.
Yeah, less headaches for them. Then we'll make sure you understand what it doesn't mean.
Right.
Android isn't going all hush-hush on us.
No.
And finally, we'll talk about, how this could change things for folks who love getting that sneak peek at what's next for their phones, the cutting edge stuff. I'm Samantha from the Today podcast,
And I'm Derek from our News and Views YouTube channel.
and we're here to unpack all of this.
You bet. You sent us a ton of really great articles from places like Android Authority, TechSpot, ZDNet,
Oh,
all the big names, and they all basically say the same thing. Google's switching up how they make Android.
yeah, the recipe's changing.
The recipe is changing. So
Mhm.
for over 16 years, part of that process has been open for everyone to see through this thing called the Android Open Source Project, or AOSP.
AOSP.
Right. But now a lot of that's going to happen behind closed doors. So our mission today is to figure out what this all means for you without getting lost in all the tech jargon.
Yeah, cut through it.
Okay.
Okay, so let's jump right in. What's actually changing here? So it sounds like for a long time, Google's been developing Android in like two different ways at the same time.
That's a really good way to think about it.
Kind of like having two sets of blueprints.
Yeah, two sets of blueprints or two versions of the instructions. So historically, Google's had these two main versions of Android going at the same time. One was public,
Okay.
which is that AOSP you mentioned, so anyone could look at parts of what they were working on. And the other was private, an internal version that Google and those big phone companies who
Right.
have special agreements with them used.
So are you saying that basically starting next week, that public-facing version is going to be like frozen in time? It won't be live anymore?
Yeah, it's not going to be showing the day-to-day work anymore. Think of it more like a snapshot or a recording that gets released later.
Okay, interesting. So the big change is that starting around March 27th, all the major stuff happening with Android development will only be happening inside Google's own world.
Pretty much. The public AOSP won't be updated with all the little changes and the nitty-gritty details of how new features are being built in real time.
Wow. So does that mean that things that used to be developed in the open, like how Bluetooth works on our phones, is now going to be like a Google secret project?
It's not really a secret project, but
Okay,
yeah, it'll
yeah.
be happening primarily at Google first. This change affects the core parts of the operating system, the heart of it all.
So even things like how my phone connects to my Bluetooth headphones or how software updates happen.
Even how software updates happen and some of the underlying security features, all that's moving behind those closed doors.
Okay. So a very big question I have is, why make this change at all?
Right.
Why would Google want to take something that's been partly in public view and make it mostly private?
Yeah, good question.
What's the thinking there?
Well, the main reason, from what all these articles say, is to streamline and simplify the whole process of building Android. Keeping those two versions going, one public and one private.
Yeah,
That created a ton of extra work for them.
I bet. I bet. So like it was causing some roadblocks or some slowdowns.
Exactly, because Google was already doing a lot of that important work internally.
Right.
On the private version, the public AOSP version was often kind of behind the times
That's
compared to what they had internally. And that meant Google's engineers had to spend tons of time and energy trying to combine the code and all the little fixes from those two separate versions.
So it's like trying to merge two different puzzle pieces that weren't meant to go together.
Yeah, it was causing those headaches.
It was causing headaches.
The articles even talk about merge conflicts.
Oh, that sounds technical.
It is, but imagine you're putting together a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
And you try to force two pieces that are kind of similar,
Right.
but not quite the same, and they just don't fit. That's kind of what was happening with the code. And that could really slow things down and even create new problems.
Makes sense.
So Google's hoping that by doing all the work in one place, internally,
Yeah.
it'll be smoother, fewer of those conflicts, and they can just move faster.
So it's all about making things more efficient on their end.
Exactly. Streamlining the process.
Gotcha.
And it fits in with this approach they've been moving towards called trunk-based development.
Trunk-based development, huh?
Yeah, think of it like a tree, right?
Oh.
You got the trunk, and all the branches are connected to it.
Right, right.
Trunk-based development is about keeping all those branches closely connected to the main trunk, making sure everything stays more in sync.
Okay,
And by having just one main internal trunk of development,
gotcha.
they're taking that idea all the way.
Okay. Now, we hear the term open source a lot when we talk about Android. Does this move mean that Android's suddenly going to become this big secret, like a closed book that no one can read anymore?
It's a really important point, and the articles really emphasize this. Android is not becoming closed source. Google's been very clear that they're still committed to Android being open.
Okay, that's good to hear. So what happens to the actual code? Like, will people still be able to see the code that makes Android work?
Yes.
Okay,
The source code for new versions of Android will still be out there, publicly available in AOSP.
okay.
But the big difference is when it gets released. It'll come out after Google has finished all the internal work and they're ready to launch the new version. So it's less like watching a live stream of the construction and more like seeing a picture of the finished building after it's done.
Right, I get it. So what about the very core of Android, that part that's based on Linux?
Right. The Android kernel uses Linux as its foundation, and that source code will still be publicly available.
Hmm.
Partly because of how the open source license, it's called GPLv2, works. The GPLv2 license, which Linux uses, requires that its code stays open.
Okay.
So that fundamental part of Android is still going to be open for everyone to see.
So it's not that the code itself is going away, it's more about the timing.
Exactly. What's changing is how often we get to see the source code for different parts of Android.
Right.
Certain things that were being developed out in the open, in that AOSP,
Yeah.
those are going to be developed internally first. So we'll only see that code when a new Android version or a major update comes out.
Okay.
It means we won't have that live view into the day-to-day development anymore.
Right.
No more minute-by-minute updates.
Gotcha. So tell me what this all means for people like me,
Right.
average, everyday
Yeah.
folks who just use their Android phones and tablets. Are we going to notice anything different?
The experts seem to think that for most Android users, this won't have a big impact on your daily experience. Your phone updates and how your apps work, all that should keep going as usual.
Okay, so my phone will keep getting updates.
The articles don't suggest otherwise.
Okay, good.
In fact, they specifically say that you shouldn't expect this to make your updates come faster or anything like that. The timing of those updates still mostly depends on who made your phone.
Okay, that's a relief.
Right.
So what about app developers and the people who make other software for Android? How will this change affect them?
Developers will still be able to get the source code when new Android versions are officially released. That basic access isn't changing.
Okay.
But it'll be harder for them to follow the progress of development in real time, as it's happening.
So no more peeking behind the curtain to see what's cooking before it's served.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Good.
Getting those early hints about new features
Right.
by looking at the constant stream of changes in the AOSP code, that's going to be trickier
Yeah,
because that ongoing work will be internal now.
makes sense. What about people who create custom versions of Android, those custom ROM developers? Will it affect them?
Well, custom ROM developers usually start with those stable, finished versions of the Android code, the releases. So they're not likely to see a big difference in how they build their stuff. They usually work with the code after it's officially released anyway. But with less transparency during development, it might be a bit harder to know what big changes are coming down the line.
So less predictability.
Yeah, a little less.
Okay. So say someone outside of Google has this amazing idea for a new Android feature, or they find a bug they want to help fix.
Right?
Can they still contribute like they used to?
From what we gather, Google still wants to accept contributions to AOSP from outside developers.
Okay.
So that avenue for the community to get involved, it's not going away completely.
Okay.
But without being able to see how things are developing in real time, it might be harder for those developers to know where to focus their efforts.
Right.
It's also tougher to figure out how their contributions might fit into Google's internal plans, which are now a bit more of a mystery.
That makes sense. It also seems like this could change things for tech news, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We often hear about upcoming Android features that are discovered early on because of those AOSP code changes.
That's a really good point. A lot of news websites and tech enthusiasts, they keep a close eye on AOSP to try and get those early scoops about what Android might do next. And now that a lot of the development is going internal, that might be harder to do.
Yeah, it's going to be more difficult.
Yeah, there are even examples in the articles we read, like how the name Pixel 10 was spotted early on in the AOSP code. Those kinds of discoveries might become less common now.
Oh, wow. So maybe fewer leaks about upcoming features then.
That's definitely a possibility. While preventing leaks might not have been the main reason for this change, it will probably have an impact on how reporters and fans get those early glimpses of upcoming stuff.
Okay, interesting. What about those big phone companies that use Android on their phones, like Samsung or Xiaomi?
Right.
They have, like, special relationships with Google, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. Major manufacturers like Samsung, Xiaomi, OnePlus,
Yeah.
they all have these special agreements with Google called Google Mobile Services, or GMS, licenses.
TMS licenses.
These licenses give them some advantages, including early access to information.
So they're still going to know what's coming down the pipeline for Android.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These partners will likely continue to get those early updates and sneak peeks, which allows them to get their own customized versions of Android ready to go, like Samsung's One UI or Xiaomi's MIUI.
Right.
So for them, the impact of this shift is probably going to be smaller.
Okay. So let's wrap up our deep dive into these Android development changes. What are the key takeaways here?
Okay, so big picture, Google's moving all that main development work for Android in-house.
Right.
So we won't be seeing those real-time updates on AOSP as much.
Yeah.
They're doing this to make their process smoother, fix those technical issues like code conflicts, and basically just build Android more efficiently.
So even though things are going to be more private day to day,
It's crucial to remember that Android will still be open source. Google's still going to release the full code to the public AOSP when those new versions are ready.
Okay.
So the code's not going away. We just won't have that live view of how it's being created.
right, like that behind the scenes look.
Exactly.
So for most of us who are just using our Android phones every day, it doesn't sound like we'll see a huge difference.
That seems to be the consensus, yeah. Your updates should keep coming, your apps should keep working.
Okay.
The biggest changes will be for the folks who really follow Android development closely. The developers, the tech enthusiasts, the people who get those early glimpses of new features by watching the AOSP code.
Yeah, the hardcore Android fans.
They'll have a bit less to work with now.
Right. Well, we hope this deep dive has given you a clear and easy to understand look at this big shift in the Android world. Now you have a better grasp on why future updates might just show up as those finished products instead of something you can follow along with in real time.
Yeah, and it really makes you think about the bigger picture too, right?
Yeah.
How might this change affect Android going forward? Will it make things faster? Will we see better updates? Or could it potentially stifle innovation?
That's a great question.
It's something to ponder as Android keeps evolving.
It is. Thanks for diving deep with us.
You bet.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.